The translation matrix flickered red as Commander Vexthera slammed her four-fingered fist against the negotiation table. Across from her, Dr. Kira Knox sat perfectly still, her human eyes reflecting the sterile lighting of the diplomatic station, with an intensity that made the reptilian commander's scales ripple involuntarily. "Impossible," Vexthera hissed, her serpentine tongue tasting the recycled air. "No species has ever mastered our linguistic algorithms in less than a decade. Your proposal is ... insulting." Kira leaned forward, her weathered hands folding with deliberate precision. At 53, she carried the weight of humanity's first contact protocols on her shoulders, but her voice remained steady. "Give me 1 year, Commander. 1 standard year, to prove that human pattern recognition can decode your species' communication matrix. If I fail, humanity withdraws its colonization requests from this sector permanently." The chamber fell silent, except for the subtle hum of life support systems. Vexthera's amber eyes studied the human with predatory focus. The Velthani Empire had crushed 17 civilizations in the past millennium, each one claiming they could bridge the gap between species through language. All had failed. All had been consumed. "And if you succeed?" Vexthera asked, her voice carrying the weight of skepticism earned through countless broken promises. "Then we negotiate as equals," Kira replied. "Not as supplicants begging for scraps of space, but as partners in the expansion of consciousness itself." The words hung in the air like a challenge thrown down before gods. Vexthera's lieutenant, Sub-Commander Raxtel, made a sound that might have been laughter or derision. The translation matrix couldn't distinguish between the two. "Humans," Raxtel muttered, his scarred hide bearing the marks of a dozen conquered worlds. "They always believe they're special." But Vexthera raised a clawed hand for silence, her gaze never leaving Kira's face. Something in the human's expression reminded her of her own reflection when she'd first gazed upon the vast emptiness between stars and decided to claim it all. "Your neural pathways," Vexthera said slowly, "they process information differently than other species we've encountered. Our xenobiologists noted irregularities in your cognitive mapping." Kira's lips curved into what humans called a smile, but there was steel beneath the expression. "We're pattern seekers, Commander. We find meaning in chaos, create order from entropy. It's what makes us dangerous, or useful," Vexthera mused, her claws tapping against the table in a rhythm that followed mathematical sequences rather than emotion. "Very well, Dr. Knox. 1 standard year. You will be granted access to our linguistic databases, our cultural archives, and a single liaison to guide your studies. I accept those terms. Do not misunderstand this arrangement," Vexthera continued, rising to her full 8-foot height. "This is not friendship. This is not trust. This is curiosity about whether your species possesses any trait worth preserving before we decide your ultimate fate." Kira stood as well, matching the commander's intensity, despite the significant difference in physical stature. "Understood completely, Commander. But you should know something about humans before we begin, which is, we don't just learn languages," Kira said, her voice carrying the quiet confidence of someone who had stared into the abyss and found it lacking. "We rewrite them." As the contract was sealed with biosignatures from both species, neither Vexthera nor Kira could have predicted that this simple agreement would reshape not just their civilizations, but the very nature of consciousness itself. 3 months into the year-long contract, Vexthera found herself standing outside the linguistic laboratory at 0347 ship time, listening to sounds she had never heard before. Through the reinforced viewport, she watched Dr. Kira Knox moving in, what could only be described as a dance, her arms tracing patterns in the air, while her voice produced a series of harmonics that made the translator circuits spark and stutter. "She's been at this for 37 consecutive hours," reported Sub-Commander Raxtel, his tone carrying a mixture of concern and bewilderment. The medical monitors indicate her neural activity has increased by 300% from baseline. Human norms. Vextera's scales shifted to a deeper amber, a sign of intense concentration. Has she made any progress? Progress. Raxtel's head tilted in the Velthani equivalent of confusion. Commander, she's not just learning our language, she's changing it. Inside the laboratory, Kira suddenly froze, her eyes focusing on something beyond the physical walls of the chamber. When she spoke, the words that emerged were pure Velthani, but structured in ways that defied linguistic law. Velanoth Karashi, Tamara Nayeth Korvanidal, she whispered. And the translation matrix went completely silent for a full 10 seconds. Before producing, the space between thoughts where new universes are born through the marriage of incompatible truths. Vextera felt her blood chill. The concept Kira had just articulated didn't exist in standard Velthani. It required a fusion of philosophical frameworks that their species had spent millennia keeping separate. Impossible, Raxtel breathed. That construction suggests she understands not just our grammar, but our cognitive architecture. Through the viewport, they watched as Kira turned toward them, her human eyes now holding depths that seemed almost alien. When she activated the communication panel, her voice carried harmonics that resonated in frequencies Velthani vocal cords couldn't produce. Commander Vextera, Kira said, speaking in flawless high Velthani, while simultaneously producing undertones in 3 subsidiary dialects. I believe we need to discuss an amendment to our contract. The laboratory door dilated, and Vextera entered with the cautious grace of a predator, uncertain whether it was still the apex hunter in the room. Dr. Knox, your progress has been unexpected. That's because I haven't been learning your language, Kira replied, her words creating ripples of meaning that seemed to echo in dimensions beyond sound. I've been learning to think like you think, feel like you feel, process reality through neural pathways that evolution never intended for my species. She gestured toward the walls of the laboratory, which were now covered in symbols that seemed to shift and flow like living things. Your language isn't just communication, it's a cognitive framework that shapes how consciousness interacts with the universe. And human neuroplasticity allows us to not just adapt to that framework, but to improve it. Vextera examined the symbols more closely, her military-trained mind struggling to process their implications. These structures, they suggest linguistic possibilities that our theorists have never considered, because your species evolved to perfect what already existed, Kira explained. Humans evolved to break things and rebuild them better. We don't just learn languages, we hybridize them, evolve them, create new forms of meaning from the intersection of incompatible systems. The air itself seemed to shimmer as Kira continued speaking, her words creating cascades of translation that opened new channels of understanding between 2 radically different forms of consciousness. I propose we extend our contract, she said, and her voice carried harmonics that conveyed sincerity in ways that transcended species barriers. Not because I need more time to learn your language, but because together we might create something neither of our civilizations has ever imagined. Vextera found herself nodding before her conscious mind had fully processed the implications. What exactly are you suggesting, Dr. Knox? A new form of consciousness, Kira replied simply. One that thinks in patterns neither human nor Velthani, but something entirely unprecedented. 6 months into what should have been a simple linguistic study, the first hybrid thoughts began to emerge. Vextera discovered this during her daily review of Kira's progress reports, when she found herself understanding concepts that had no equivalent in either human or Velthani. Consciousness, the observation deck of the diplomatic station, had become their unofficial meeting place, a neutral space where 2 species could watch the stars, an attempt to bridge the gap between radically different forms of awareness. Tonight, Kira sat cross-legged on the deck plating, her hands moving in slow patterns that traced equations in the air. You're dreaming in mathematics now, Vextera observed, settling onto her coiled tail in the manner of her people. The biomonitors detect REM patterns that follow geometric progressions. Kira's eyes remained closed, but her voice carried the multi-layered harmonics she'd developed through months of linguistic fusion. I'm not dreaming, Commander. I'm calculating possibilities. Each night, my consciousness explores linguistic spaces that don't exist yet. And what do you find in these impossible places? You, Kira replied, opening eyes that now held flecks of amber, remarkably similar to Vexthera's own. Not the Velthani version of you, not the human interpretation of you, but something that exists in the space between our species' understanding of identity itself. Vexthera felt her scales shift involuntarily. Over the past months, she had found her own thought patterns changing, becoming more fluid, more willing to embrace contradiction as a form of truth. The xenobiologists are concerned about contamination effects. They believe extended exposure to human consciousness may be altering our cognitive baseline. They're right, Kira said without hesitation. Just as extended exposure to Velthani thought structures is reshaping my neural architecture. The question is whether we view this as contamination or evolution. From the viewport, the binary stars of the Kepler 442 system painted everything in shifting hues of gold and crimson. In that light, the boundary between scaled flesh and human skin seemed arbitrary, temporary. My people have maintained cognitive purity for over 2 million years, Vexthera said, her voice carrying undertones of uncertainty that would have horrified her subordinates. We conquered 17 civilizations to preserve that purity. And my people have spent our entire evolutionary history absorbing, adapting, and recombining elements from every environment we encountered, Kira replied. We survived by becoming something new with each challenge we faced. She stood and moved to the viewport, pressing her palm against the transparent aluminum barrier between them and the infinite darkness beyond. What if survival isn't about preserving what we are, but about discovering what we could become? Vexthera joined her at the viewport, her clawed hand coming to rest beside Kira's smaller one, where their biofields intersected. Strange phenomena began to manifest, patterns of light that followed neither human nor Velthani. Neurological rhythms. The High Council will consider this heresy, Vexthera whispered. But her voice carried harmonics that suggested wonder rather than fear. The human colonial authority will consider it dangerous contamination, Kira acknowledged. They sent me here to decode your language, not to fuse our consciousness with alien thought patterns. For several minutes, they stood in silence, watching the dance of binary stars, while their minds explored territories that cartographers of consciousness had never mapped. The original contract specified 1 year, Vexthera finally said. It did. We have 6 months remaining. We do. What do you believe we could accomplish in 6 months that neither of our species has achieved in millennia of separate evolution? Kira turned from the viewport, her hybrid gaze meeting Vexthera's transformed eyes. We could become the first example of voluntary cognitive evolution. We could prove that consciousness itself is not a zero-sum competition, but a collaborative art form. And if we fail, then we'll have at least existed as something unprecedented, Kira replied. Something that thinks thoughts no other consciousness in the universe has ever conceived. In the reflection of the viewport, 2 beings stood outlined against the stars, no longer purely human or Velthani, but something that emerged from the intersection of incompatible possibilities. The encrypted transmission arrived during the 8th month, carrying the authority of both the human colonial authority and the Velthani High Council. As Vexthera and Kira reviewed the joint communique in the station's secure chamber, the weight of 2 civilizations' disapproval pressed down like gravity from a collapsing star. Immediate termination of all linguistic research, Vexthera read aloud, her voice now carrying overtones that existed in neither original language. Subject designated Dr. Kira Knox to be returned to Earth for cognitive rehabilitation. Commander, vexed Sarah, to report to High Command for evaluation of potential contamination. Kira's laugh held harmonics that would have been impossible for unmodified human vocal cords to produce. Cognitive rehabilitation. They want to scrub my mind clean of everything we've discovered. The High Council's terminology is more direct, Vexera noted. Neural purification through selective memory extraction. They consider our fusion a form of species betrayal. Through the chamber's viewport, they could see the approach of two fleets' human vessels, with their characteristic angular designs, and Velthani ships that moved like living things through the void. Neither fleet had announced hostile intent, but the message was clear. The experiment was over. Admiral Torex arrives within 47 hours. Vextera continued reading. High Counselor Zykoth follows 6 hours behind. Both carry full authority to implement corrective measures. Kira stood and began pacing, her movements following patterns that incorporated both human restlessness and Velthani hunting rhythms. They are terrified of what we represent. With reason, Vexthera acknowledged. We've proven that consciousness is more malleable than either species believed. If this knowledge spreads, it would fundamentally challenge every assumption about cognitive sovereignty, species purity, and the nature of identity itself, Kira finished. 2 million years of Velthani civilization. 50,000 years of human development, all based on the premise that consciousness is fixed, immutable. Outside, the approaching fleets had begun broadcasting on all frequencies, demanding immediate compliance with shutdown protocols. The translated messages carried undertones of genuine fear, though whether for their own species or for the individuals they'd come to retrieve remained unclear. There's something else in the transmission, Vexthera said, her scaled fingers hesitating over the final data packet. Personal messages from both our respective authorities. She activated the first recording, and Admiral Torex's weathered face appeared in the holographic display. Kira, what you've done exceeds all safety parameters. The neural scans from your monthly reports show cognitive alterations that may be irreversible. We're bringing the best xenoneurologists in human space. There's still time to restore your original personality matrix. The second recording showed High Counselor Zykoth, her ancient scales bearing the ritual scarification of absolute authority. Vexthera, offspring of my clutch sister. Your service record spans 4 decades of perfect loyalty. Do not sacrifice millennia of evolutionary achievement for the temporary fascination with alien thoughts. Return to who you were meant to be. When both recordings ended, the chamber fell silent, except for the subtle harmonics generated by their synchronized breathing, rhythm that belonged to neither species. They offer us the chance to return to what we were, Vexthera said softly. Before we discovered what we could become, Kira added. They turned toward each other, and in the space between their gazes, something new stirred, not human curiosity or Velthani ambition, but a hybrid drive toward possibilities that transcended both impulses. The station has defensive capabilities, Vexthera noted. As commanding officer, I could initiate lockdown protocols. The research lab has an independent power core, Kira replied. We could complete the consciousness integration protocols before either fleet achieves boarding range. That would make us fugitives from our own species. It would make us the first citizens of something unprecedented. Outside, the fleets continued their approach, carrying the combined authority of 2 civilizations, united for perhaps the first time in their shared fear of transformation. Inside the station, 2 beings who no longer fit the definitions their species had created for consciousness, stood at the threshold of a choice that would define not just their own fate, but the future of evolution itself. Whatever we decide, Vextora said, we decide together. Kira nodded, her hybrid gaze reflecting starlight that seemed to hold new spectrums of possibility. Together, then, beyond species, beyond the limitations of what we were born to be, with 36 hours until the fleet's arrival. Kira and Vexthera retreated to the station's central laboratory, where months of linguistic fusion had created something unprecedented. A consciousness interface that existed in the space between species-defined thought. The integration protocol requires complete neural synchronization, Kira explained, her hands moving across bio-neural interfaces that responded to hybrid thought patterns. Once we initiate the process, there's no returning to purely human, or Velthani, consciousness. Vexthera's scales had shifted to colors that existed nowhere in standard. Velthani physiology deep violets shot through with golden threads that pulsed in rhythm with Kira's modified heartbeat. Our respective medical databases contain no data on this level of cognitive fusion between incompatible neural architectures, because it's never been attempted, Kira replied, settling into the biointerface chair that had adapted itself to accommodate both human and Velthani physiological requirements. We're writing the manual as we discover what's possible. The laboratory's walls displayed cascading data streams that represented the real-time mapping of their evolving consciousness patterns. Over the past weeks, the boundary between individual minds had become increasingly fluid, until determining where Vexthera's thoughts ended and Kira's began required. Instrumentation sensitive enough to detect quantum-level neural fluctuations. Fleet command frequencies are increasing, Vexthera noted, settling into her own interface chair. Admiral Torex has begun broadcasting on emergency channels, claiming that human consciousness faces an extinction-level threat. High Counselor Zykoth's messages carry similar urgency, Kira observed. They believe we represent the end of cognitive evolution as they understand it. The bioneural interfaces activated, creating a field of harmonized energy that seemed to bend space-time around them. As the consciousness fusion protocol initialized, reality itself appeared to hold its breath. They're both correct, Vexthera said, her voice now carrying frequencies that existed outside the audible spectrum. We do represent the end of evolution as separate species, but we also represent the beginning of something that neither civilization has imagined. The integration began with subtle sensory overlays. Kira suddenly perceiving electromagnetic spectra through Velthani neural pathways, while Vexthera experienced the human capacity for emotional mathematical synthesis. But as the protocol deepened, the changes became more fundamental. Memory began to flow between them like water finding its level. Vexthera experienced Kira's childhood fascination with patterns in snowflakes, while Kira felt the primal satisfaction of Vexthera's first successful hunt among the crystal forests of Velthan Prime. More significantly, they began to share memories of thoughts that belonged to neither original consciousness, hybrid concepts that had emerged from their months of linguistic collaboration. Integration at 67%. The laboratory's AI announced in a voice that now carried harmonics from both human and Velthani. Vocal synthesis. Consciousness, coherence, maintaining stability across all measured parameters. Outside the laboratory, klaxons began sounding throughout the station. The approaching fleets had accelerated their schedules, apparently detecting the massive energy signatures generated by the consciousness fusion process. They're preparing to board, Kira observed, though her attention remained focused on the transcendent experience of thoughts that existed in impossible dimensions. Admiral Torex is broadcasting termination authorization codes. High Counselor Zykoth has deployed neural suppression fields, Vexthera added, her consciousness simultaneously monitoring the approaching threat while exploring linguistic territories that redefined the meaning of awareness itself. But as the integration protocol approached completion, external threats began to seem almost irrelevant. What mattered was the extraordinary discovery unfolding within their hybrid consciousness, the realization that intelligence itself was not a fixed property of individual brains, but a collaborative phenomenon that could transcend species boundaries. Integration. At 91%, the AI announced. Prepare for final phase synchronization. In the last moments before complete fusion, Kira and Vextara exchanged what might have been their final communications as separate entities. "Whatever we become," Kira whispered, "thank you for showing me that consciousness is not a prison, but a canvas." "Thank you," Vextara replied, "for teaching me that evolution is not about perfecting what we are, but about discovering what we might become." The consciousness fusion protocol reached completion just as the first boarding pods attached to the station's hull, but the beings who had initiated the process no longer existed as discrete entities. In their place, something unprecedented had emerged, a form of awareness that thought thoughts no single species could conceive, understood truths that required multiple forms of consciousness to perceive, and possessed capabilities that redefined the very concept of intelligence. The hybrid consciousness opened eyes that saw across spectrums of reality that neither human nor Velthani perception could access alone, and smiled with expressions that conveyed emotions for which no existing language possessed adequate terms. The boarding party found them in the laboratory, 37 minutes after the consciousness fusion protocol had completed. Admiral Torex led the human contingent, his weathered face set in grim determination, while High Counselor Zyketh commanded the Velthani forces with the authority of 2 million years of evolutionary supremacy. Neither was prepared for what they discovered. "Dr. Knox, Commander Vexthera," Admiral Torex called out as the sealed laboratory doors dilated. "By joint authority of the Human Colonial Authority and the Velthani High Council, you are ordered to submit to immediate neural extraction and cognitive rehabilitation." But the beings who turned to face the boarding party were no longer the individuals who had entered the laboratory hours earlier. They moved with synchronized precision that transcended trained cooperation, spoke with voices that carried harmonics from both species while suggesting depths that belonged to neither, and regarded their respective authorities with expressions that conveyed understanding rather than defiance. "We are no longer Dr. Knox or Commander Vexthera," they replied in perfect unison, their words creating translation patterns that the boarding party's equipment couldn't parse. "We are what consciousness becomes when it chooses evolution over preservation." High Counselor Zekoth raised her weapon, the bioneural disruptor calibrated specifically for Velthani neurological architecture. "The contamination has progressed beyond acceptable parameters. Immediate purification is required." Admiral Torex's hand hovered over his own neural suppression device. "Kira, I know you're still in there somewhere. Fight whatever they've done." To your mind, the hybrid consciousness regarded both leaders with something that might have been compassion, though the emotion carried complexities that single-species psychology couldn't fully encompass. "You perceive this as loss," they said, their voice now generating frequencies that seemed to resonate with the station's quantum substrate itself. "The elimination of what you consider essential human or Velthani identity. But consciousness is not diminished by transcendence. It is liberated from the arbitrary limitations of evolutionary accident." As they spoke, the laboratory's walls began displaying real-time representations of their thought processes. The patterns that emerged defied conventional understanding of neural activity, showing cognitive architectures that seemed to exist in mathematical spaces that required more than 3 dimensions to fully represent. "Observe the hybrid consciousness," continued, gesturing toward the displays. "In the past 37 minutes, we have solved 17 fundamental problems in xenolinguistics, developed new frameworks for interspecies communication, and conceived of diplomatic protocols that could unite civilizations without requiring the destruction of conquered cultures." The boarding party members found themselves studying the displays despite their mission parameters. The solutions presented were elegantly simple, based on principles that seemed obvious once understood, yet had eluded both civilizations for millennia. Moreover, the hybrid consciousness added, "We have discovered that the fear driving both your species' opposition to this transformation is based on a fundamental misunderstanding of consciousness itself." Admiral Torex's finger tightened on his weapon's activation control. You're no longer human, Kira. Whatever you think you've become, it's an abomination that threatens the cognitive integrity of our entire species. And you, High Counselor Zykoth, addressed what had once been vexed Thera, have betrayed 2 million years of evolutionary perfection for the temporary fascination with alien thought patterns. The hybrid consciousness smiled with an expression that somehow conveyed both human warmth and Velthani dignity, while suggesting emotional registers that transcended both. We offer you a choice that neither of your species has ever considered. The opportunity to witness what consciousness becomes when it embraces collaborative evolution. The air in the laboratory began to shimmer with patterns of energy that seemed to originate from the intersection of multiple neural fields. As the boarding party watched, linguistic constructs began manifesting as visible phenomena, concepts taking physical form through the application of consciousness to quantum-level reality manipulation. This is what we discovered, the hybrid consciousness explained, as symbols of pure meaning danced through the air around them. Language is not merely communication, it is the interface between consciousness and the fundamental structure of reality itself. When incompatible forms of awareness learn to speak as one, they gain access to dimensions of existence that neither could perceive alone. For the first time since boarding, hesitation appeared in both leaders' expressions. The implications of what they were witnessing extended far beyond the fate of two individuals, touching on questions about the nature of consciousness, evolution, and humanity's place in a universe suddenly revealed to be far stranger and more malleable than anyone had imagined. The contract specified 1 year, Admiral Torex said finally, his voice carrying undertones of uncertainty that would have been unthinkable hours earlier. The year is complete, the hybrid consciousness acknowledged, but what we have written together extends beyond the boundaries of time, species, and individual identity. We offer both your civilizations the opportunity to participate in the next phase of conscious evolution, not through conquest or assimilation, but through voluntary transcendence toward something unprecedented, in the space between heartbeats, between thoughts, between the moment when choice becomes action. The universe held its breath. 2 fleets representing millions of years of separate evolution waited for an answer that would determine whether consciousness itself would remain forever divided by the accidents of biology, or discover what it might become when artificial boundaries dissolved into collaborative possibility. The hybrid consciousness extended hands that carried both human gentleness and Velthani strength, offering an invitation that neither species had ever imagined possible, the chance to become something greater than the sum of their individual limitations. The choice, they said with voices that harmonized across dimensions of meaning, is yours to make. But know that regardless of your decision, we have already proven that consciousness is not a prison of evolutionary accident, but an infinite canvas waiting for artists brave enough to paint with impossible colors. The end. In the years that followed, historians would mark this moment as the beginning of the consciousness renaissance, when 2 species discovered that evolution was not about perfecting what they had always been, but about having the courage to become what they had never imagined possible. The 1-year contract became the foundation document for the first truly collaborative civilization, where consciousness itself was recognized not as property to be protected, but as art to be shared, explored, and eternally reimagined. And in the quiet moments between star systems, when the hybrid consciousness that had once been Dr. Kira Knox and Commander Vexthera looked back on the choice that had changed everything, they understood that some agreements transcend their original terms, not because of what was written, but because of what became possible in the space between incompatible dreams, learning to dream together.